Hello, my name is Dr. Tim McClanahan. I work with the Wildlife Conservation Society. I've been active in the Indian Ocean for the last 35 years or so, and I'm grateful to Ranjit and Vikash for organizing this workshop and being able to present the first hour of this introduction to coral reefs. I've been working on coral reefs for quite some time in the Indian Ocean and Mauritius. I first came here in 2001 and began collecting field data in 2004 with the help of Ruby within Palais, and I have a keen interest in a number of the issues in Mauritius, and I'll give you some idea of that interest and the overview, and particularly the context in the Western Indian Ocean. I'd like to talk about three challenges that most coral reefs face, and those particularly in Mauritius, and that's climate change, sustainable fishing, and protecting biodiversity and endemics. All of these are affecting Mauritius in various ways, and I hope to give you some context to what sort of the state of science is in each of these topics. I'll have to be brief on each of the topics to cover all of them, but I think that if you listen carefully, you'll learn a lot about the current state of coral reef conservation science on each of these three topics. Climate change in coral reefs is largely synonymous with coral bleaching. This is the loss of color in corals, often due to the breakdown of the symbiotic relationship between corals and algae. The small microalgae leave under heat and light stress, and what you're seeing is the underlying coral skeleton. This is generally believed to occur when temperatures exceed a certain threshold, often 1 degree centigrade above the mean summer maximum. But it can be greatly modified by chronic stresses in the background conditions and by the other water quality and other variables during that time of the heat stress. It tends to be considered a global phenomenon with fairly uniform responses across taxa and geography, but my argument is that that's an overly simplistic view of bleaching, and that in many cases it depends a great deal on the taxa of corals, but also specifically on the chronic stresses that corals are exposed to. So in order to give you some idea about that variability, I've plotted the sea surface temperature variability metrics in the Western Indian Ocean here, so that you can get some idea of how these things vary. And you can see here that there are 6 different categories or groups of sea surface temperature. Each of them has a slightly unique difference in the chronic and acute stresses, and this is, in my opinion, will greatly influence the outcomes of climate change, because there will be certain adaptations or acclimation conditions within the corals within each of these sea surface temperature regions, and that will affect the outcome. So what you're seeing in the top graph is a plot of those 6 categories of temperature for this region, in which you can see the distribution among some of the variability metrics, such as the standard deviations, by bimodality, the cumulative amount of excess heat, skewness, and kurtosis. If you look at Mauritius in particular, you'll see that Mauritius is in cluster 4, and the properties of high variation in sea surface temperature are there. That's expected from its temperate position. Also high bimodality, that would be the seasonality. Pretty high cumulative degree heating weeks, which means that it is getting exposed to thermal stresses above the mean summer temperature. But they all have some other factors, such as a moderate temperature rise, but some temperature distribution metrics, such as kurtosis and skewness, that may greatly influence the outcomes, as I'll show later. In general, Mauritius has somewhat flat distributions. That means it has thick tails and that gives its corals a certain amount of acclimation to stress. It is not strong. There's not strong skew in the temperature, and also that often means the acute stresses may not be that extreme in this environment. So when you look at climate change, as I'll show later, these context-specific conditions can be quite important for the outcomes. Coral reef bleaching is a relatively new science. It's a young field of science, and so like many young fields of science, there's periods of discovery that are going on. Before about 1998, when bleaching was not observed very frequently, it was sort of an oddity, and in many cases people were asking, what is this bleaching? And they had to study the algae and the corals and figure out that it was this breakdown of the coral bleaching. It's the breakdown of the symbiosis that I mentioned before. And so during that stage, it was just simply a descriptive science trying to understand what was going on when corals were exposed to some sort of extreme conditions. That often was extreme warm water, or it could be also even extreme cold water, but this was a mechanism by which corals responded, and there's an ongoing debate as to whether this is adaptive or just simply a measure of dysfunction in coral reefs, and that debate is still ongoing in many ways. After some time, there was some theory to develop what caused coral bleaching, what were the conditions that created it. The early studies often used a model that I call the threshold model. That is, above a certain unusually warm water level, often about 1 degree centigrade above the summer baseline, corals began to bleach, and that bleaching resulted in unhealthy corals, diseases, and mortality. So the threshold model was one of the earliest models, and then today it's still a very popular model. But later, people began to make more measurements about different types of temperature patterns, the distributions of temperatures, other modifying variables like light, water quality, currents, a number of factors, and that became the examination of more variables in what I often call variability models. That is, that the interactions between chronic and acute stress often were what caused this bleaching. And in this, up until fairly recently, these two views of coral reefs have been working somewhat independently of each other. They often share some of the same metrics, but they have different types of assumptions about this phenomenon. And I think more recently, particularly since about the 2016 or 2018 when papers were published, we're seeing more sort of testing and modification of these two theories in many cases as the data accumulates, and there's bleaching surveys done on very broad scales at this point. Here I'm showing you a timeline of studies of some of the variables that people have looked at over the past 30-some years. And you can see that some of the degree heating weeks or the excess thermal stress metrics were very popular in the beginning. And as we proceed forward with the science, we're beginning to see more modifying variables being added to this study. These include various things like the geography, the longitude and latitude, and ecoregions and provinces. And many of these studies are finding these are significant patterns in the bleaching response. More recently, they're looking at human influences and environmental modifying variables, habitats, but in general, these are smaller contributions to the analysis of the bleaching response. As I said before, as studies accumulate more observations, they're also able to access more data, usually from satellites, and use that satellite information to evaluate the importance of these variables. So in this particular case of studying 114 journal articles, I find 58 variables being examined, but some of them are often dominant and repeated over time. one of the reasons we're interested in understanding the factors that cause bleaching is because we're trying to find sanctuaries, areas that corals are not experiencing stress, or if they are experiencing stress, they're somehow adapting to that stress in order that they survive into the future. So from the conservation point of view, the search for sanctuaries is a core part of what we do these days. So one of the things I'm asking myself is, are there sanctuaries in the Western Indian Ocean? Where are they located, and what can we do about them? But in order to do that, you have to realize that there are basically three types of sanctuaries. There's not a single type of sanctuary, but there are avoidance sanctuaries. These are areas that just manage to avoid any stressful conditions. There are resistance sanctuaries. These are animals in these environments that for whatever reason have resistance to thermal stresses. And there are recovery sanctuaries. These are areas that once they are disturbed, they can eventually recover due to the conditions that promote recovery in these areas. So understanding where these sanctuaries are, it's clear that you need to define each of these three types of sanctuaries in order to understand what might be the best locations to work at. Clearly, avoidance sanctuaries are often where people focus the most, and there are a number of those identified, but as I'll show later, depending on how you define your sanctuary in terms of the metrics you use, you can come up with very different locations as sanctuaries, and that becomes important as we try and prioritize where to work. Just to give you an idea of the diversity of approaches, I've again used a multivariate analysis to evaluate these 114 papers and how they're distributed in terms of the types of variables they look at, whether it's excess thermal stress or modifying variables, geography, coral, benthic cover, habitats, or human influences, and then my definition of them as either a threshold or a variability model of analysis. And what you can see is that many of the threshold there's many threshold models, and many of them are on the left of this diagram, indicating that they're not looking at a large number of variables typically. The variability models are to the right, and then you can see some of them use different numbers of variables for each of those types of categories of stress or modifying stress. So that now allows us to maybe define our sanctuaries a little bit better as well, that the threshold models, sanctuaries are generally be areas that avoid these thermal stresses, whereas these variability models may indicate areas that have more modifying environments, things that may give them some resistance to thermal stress or possibly even the potential for recovery. So you can see now that we're sort of dividing our metrics into those that might provide different types of sanctuary among those three types. Typically, avoidance would be a property of the threshold models, and environmental variability would be more typical of the resistance and the recovery models. So one of the things that I've done is I've looked at the papers that have identified sanctuaries. There are about 35 papers that identify sanctuaries, and they each use slightly different methodologies, some thresholds, some variability type thresholds, and then I plotted them in space in terms of the types of models they have, and each of these colored areas here is an example of a specific type of model trying to identify a sanctuary. And what you can see is most of the region could be considered a sanctuary depending on what metrics you use and how you define your sanctuary. So in many cases, this has been useful work, but what it identifies is the fact that we can end up with very different results depending on the types of metrics we use, and therefore it becomes important to distinguish between these many alternatives, which of them actually work or don't work in terms of predicting coral cover and or the coral community and its ability to stay intact over time. In the absence of that, you are stuck with the difficulty of making decisions, And in such a case, you might do the intelligent thing of creating a portfolio of sanctuaries where you distribute your effort maybe evenly or some way weightedly among those three options. And here you can see these would be some of those 3 or 4 options, depending on the method used. You could decide, okay, well, we'll focus some of our efforts on avoidance, and others on resistance, and other on recovery, in order that whatever turns out to be strongest, we'll at least have our bases covered. And while that is a good early entry approach to this problem, a better approach is if you can actually figure out which models are actually doing the best at predicting the future states of reef, and then focus on those. And in principle, we should continue to learn and compete these ideas against one another in order that we can ultimately come up with weighing our effort more appropriately to those areas that are most likely to survive best into the future. Note going forward that I'm presenting some of the papers that are recently published, and for those students that are keen to dive into the literature, I suggest you check the references below. Time won't allow me to go into a lot of detail on any of these issues, but I thought it'd be important here to give an example of a models about future predictions about coral reefs based on the different types of modeling approaches. And here I'm comparing a threshold model, which is a model of mortality for corals when thresholds are passed in 2050. And then I'll compare that with what I call a variability model, but it's an empirical model where I examine 14 variables associated with coral, and based on the best model, I predict the coral cover in 2020, which is about 35%, and then we predicted in 2050 based on how those variables are predicted to change by the global climate model into the future. And you can see from this graph there are very large differences in coral cover in the Western Indian Ocean. These are the cumulative number of cells in the Indian Ocean. There are about 10,000 plus 6.25 square kilometer cells that have coral reefs in them. This is the distribution of those cells in terms of a cumulative frequency, in terms of the predicted coral cover in 2020 and then in 2015 based on the different scenarios. And you can see that the threshold model has a very dire predictions for coral reefs. That is, basically 90% of the reefs will have coral cover less than 25% in 2050. But the predictions are much less dire for the empirical model, where we see that some things are important, such as fisheries restrictions, that if you increase fisheries restrictions in 2050, you'll get a considerable improvement on coral cover, and that's because currently restricted fisheries areas, whether closures or gear-restricted areas, generally have about 10% higher coral cover than those areas without those restrictions. So if those are implemented in the future, coral cover is quite good and doesn't change quite as much as expected. And also, if people embrace the carbon emission reduction scenario, the 2.6 scenario, you'll also see that the conditions in the future are considerably better for corals. So this gives us some hope that for better conditions in the future, but that hope is dependent on how well this empirical or variability model does in predicting corals now and in the future. One approach to finding sanctuaries is to look for where models overlap. So in this case of the threshold and the variability model, if you plot them against each other for the two different scenarios, you can see a lot of scatter, but there are actually locations where the two models predict similar outcomes. And so if you're looking for areas, say, with greater than 25% coral cover in 2050, you can find places that both models predict that. And that tends to be the areas in red here, which include areas in the Mascarene Islands into Madagascar and across to the African coastline along that equatorial current. So it's possible that those might be high priorities because, in fact, they have the elements of two models, quite different models, making very similar predictions in a case where, in fact, the two models diverge considerably in terms of many of the other locations. So again, it would be good to know which of these models is better at predicting coral cover, but in the absence of that, we can look at the overlap as one way to identify sanctuaries. Another approach is to not just look at these environmental variables and their predictions into the future, but look at some other important elements of coral reefs. In this case, I've added coral diversity based on my studies of coral diversity in these specific areas, and identify where environmental exposure is low, where there's high levels of avoidance in principle, and then when there's high diversity. And those areas with low exposure and high diversity are marked in red here, and they show Mauritius is one of those areas, and particularly northern Madagascar, but also particularly the area between Mozambique and southern Kenya, and then the border regions of Kenya and Tanzania, where we currently have a climate refuge project. So the idea here is to assume that coral diversity is a good thing, and that it's a measure of basically avoidance of environmental stress. So you have another indicator rather than just coral cover alone as an indicator of where these sanctuaries are. So this is another approach that we're using. So if we look at Mauritius, although it might be identified by some metrics as a sanctuary, we also know there's a lot of repeated thermal stress occurring, particularly since about 2008 in Mauritius. In many cases, the threshold for bleaching is quite low in Mauritius, one of the lowest in the world, because it's a temperate area, and you can get coral bleaching to occur as low as 27.5 degrees centigrade, whereas in much of the rest of the tropical world it's as high as 31. So the corals are not as adapted to warm water as they are in other areas. So we've had these frequent bleaching events over time, and the result have been losses of coral cover. That's been reported in the national coral monitoring studies, but many of those monitoring studies are using growth forms and not biodiversity, so less is known about what's happening to the biodiversity in these areas. Another thing is that if you look at the mortality of coral over time, you'll notice that it tends to be patchy. It's not a uniform loss. There are some areas that have maintained coral cover at quite high levels over time, some that have lost it. And part of the reason for that is that the distribution of thermal stress around the island can be quite patchy. One of the things that we found was one of the strongest predictors of changes in coral cover and diversity was thermal stress anomaly, shown here at TSA. The rarity of the thermal stress anomalies was actually one of the strongest predictors of changes in the coral community, and you can see that your marine park, Blue Bay, was actually one of the areas that received the highest thermal stress anomalies. Here you're looking at cumulative frequencies, such that there were quite a few large thermal anomalies in Blue Bay and less so in other areas. So these anomalies vary around the island, and Mauritius is particularly important because you have a small microcosm. You have a windward side where the currents hit the coastline with their own conditions, and you have a leeward side which is more protected from currents, and it creates a natural laboratory for understanding what might create resistance and or recovery of corals along this island. In principle, you have a little limited area field study to look at these factors. And so originally in 2004, when we first came here, we used this natural laboratory to ask what might be the impacts of coral thermal stress and the subsequent response to corals in this island. And one of the interesting findings was that it was actually the windward side of the island, particularly the southern windward side, that seemed to experience the worst bleaching. And that in many ways is not necessarily intuitive, because in that area there's good current flow, the conditions for coral growth are good. But in fact, what we found was during thermal stress events, the conditions changed more dramatically compared to background conditions. So you get these acute deviations away from mean conditions, and it's that deviation away from mean conditions that creates stress for the corals. Whereas when you go more to the north and the leeward side of the island, those areas have been experiencing more variable conditions over time, and when they get these acute events, they're more adapted to those particular acute events. And so in many cases, you find those leeward areas are actually doing better than the windward areas. This map of Mauritius shows you in the center of the map the distribution of currents, and you can see the strongest currents in the south and east, and the weakest in the north and west. And this corresponds pretty closely to the acuteness of the temperature. Stress more acute in the south and less acute in the north because of the currents, and then how they change during these stressful events. They often slow down considerably. You get doldrum conditions, and what used to have current flow no longer has good current flow. The temperatures rise, and corals that were used to living in this benign environment suddenly are stressed. So what you can see, if you look at the red dots, these are areas that lost a high number of species, almost some of them as much as 90% of the species were lost, and that these are located on the southern part of Mauritius, including the marine park in Blue Bay. In many of those areas you can see high coral cover, but it's largely tabular acropora, and many of the other genera have disappeared due to the stress. And so we found that in fact a number of corals have actually disappeared from those study sites over time, 3 species in particular that I'll talk a little bit more about later. And whereas you're up in the north, you have generally fairly low losses of species. So coral cover and species losses need not be the same. It's also, if you look at sort of the predictions of sanctuaries in Mauritius, you can see the variability model predicts a lot of Mauritius as a sanctuary, which is simply not the case. And the threshold model considers mostly the southern leeward side as a sanctuary, but in fact that's not very accurate as well. If anything tends to be accurate, it would be the north and west. So the problem here you can see is that we have models that are not that good at predicting, but it depends on what you're looking at. They're not, the models in these cases were for predicting coral cover, whereas the data on the left is actually numbers of species. So you could have a model that predicts coral cover reasonably well. Possibly the variability model is saying, well, coral cover is going to do all right in general in Mauritius, but the empirical data is showing you can have major losses of biodiversity, and particularly in the southern region. So this creates some of the issues, but why Mauritius is interesting from a scientific point of view is the natural laboratory effect is that we're being able to ask these questions, and many of the answers here will help you solve some of the problems more broadly, because this sort of leeward, windward current, high current, low current, chronic acute stress repeats itself throughout the world. And Mauritius, we have some of the data to test some of these ideas. So as I said, Mauritius is losing species. We're hoping to make people aware of that through some of these announcements and policy briefs. This is an example where we show a few of the species that seem to be not being found or may be disappearing. Coral on the top there is called Herpolitha. It disappeared out of our sites, but fortunately we've seen it since then in other sites. So we know it's still in Mauritius. It's just that it seems its numbers are probably reducing because in the sites we selected it disappeared over a 15-year period. So that's another conservation concern, is where are these corals that are disappearing, where are they located in Mauritius, and is there anything we can do to improve their survival into the future? The other coral below it is called Pleurogyra, again, a very interesting coral. Disappeared out of our study sites, but we saw a colony of it in an area in the northeast of Mauritius. So it still exists, and that's a hopeful sign. What you can see so far is that the issues are complicated and the science is moving forward and the learning is occurring, but is in many cases slow. Probably the original focus on avoidance sanctuaries may be focusing on areas that may be sensitive to catastrophes when these conditions change dramatically, much like they did in the southern and eastern part of Mauritius over the last 10 years or so. And that maybe what we should be looking at is more resistance and recovery sanctuaries, and that these may be located in areas where there's intermediate levels of thermal stress, that they get some low chronic stress, so they're exposed to stress. So when acute stress comes along, they can resist it to some extent and possibly recover well. And if you look at some of the empirical data in these figures below, this is showing coral cover as a function of cumulative heat stress. And what you can see in many cases, they're hump-shaped relationships. That is, coral cover is doing fairly well where there is some level of thermal anomaly. So it may be that this idea can create this new set of sanctuaries. Those are the resistance and recovery sanctuaries. And those complemented with the avoidance sanctuaries may give us different types of sanctuaries and different types of locations. And then again, it's having a portfolio, a mix of those may be important. But we need to identify avoidance sanctuaries that in fact are actually avoiding stress, as opposed to just delaying the stress to some future period when catastrophes can occur. So I think we're making progress, and now our plan is over the next few years is to identify these types of sanctuaries and then give them priority in terms of the conservation efforts that we promote with the governments and NGOs that we work with. I'd like to move on to the second topic of sustainable fishing. This is important for the status of reefs in terms of both maintaining coral cover and coral growth, but it's also critical for food security and even for biodiversity, as I'll show later. One of the main things I do as a conservation biologist is count fish underwater, identify them to the species, measure their sizes, estimate their stock biomass or weights, and this gives me some indication of what the status of a fishery is. And this is independent of the fishery itself, so it tells me more information about how fish as species are doing. One of the things I can tell you I notice a lot is the lack of carnivores, especially large carnivores. And these are two examples of groups that are largely disappearing out of heavily fished reefs in the region. Groupers, the large ones, are very difficult to see these days. There are groupers, but they're the small-bodied ones that are often less than 30 centimeters. Sweetlips on the right is another example of a group that is, in many cases, disappearing. In our region, you might find them in parks, but outside of parks, they become very rare. And in Mauritius, they're quite rare. I've seen a few individuals of some species, but there are some species I've never seen. And I assume that is due to their sensitivity to certain types of fishing gear. So we're beginning to see losses, and many of them may be even threatened with extinction, but not that much is known about them. Not a lot of information is collected on them, so our knowledge about them is somewhat limited. To enter into this subject, I just wanted to show the outcomes of a recent paper which effectively looked at the rising effort on the left and the declining catch per unit effort in the Mozambique Channel. This is what is called catch reconstruction, which is an attempt by a group of academics to evaluate how fishing effort and catch per unit effort has changed over time. And what you can see here is a rising effort and then a declining CPU. This is to be expected. But in many cases, the catch per unit effort in many areas, particularly after the introduction of motorized boats, is very low, often at what you might call replacement level. That is, the amount of energy you consume is not that different from the amount of energy you produce. That's not a good location to be in a fishery. You need a net profit of energy. And in many cases, you're seeing that that's not the case. So in many cases, there's a lot of poverty associated with fishing because of this lack of net profitability in terms of energy and income. I just want to remind people unfamiliar with fisheries that the basis of a lot of fisheries analysis and modeling is based on this, what's called the growth of the logistic yield model, which is what happens to a population as it recovers from a disturbance like fishing. And this model is often a good indicator of where your yields are maximized, usually at some level around half of the maximum stock levels. And so in order to understand the status of a fishery, you often have to know what this maximum level is, or what's often called K, or in this case K, but oftentimes called pristine biomass, or B sub naught. And that's not really well known for coral reefs, at least until I started working on it. Most people didn't know what the maximum biomass was, because in many cases almost all the areas were already fished, and there was no records of pre-fishing conditions. So I spent a good part of my career trying to figure out what this K or B sub naught level was, based on reconstruction of fish biomass in marine reserves, areas protected from all forms of fishing. And because the reserves are of different ages, you can piece together or reconstruct what biomass might change like over time. Here you can see the results of some of this field work, where you can see the recovery of fish biomass with the age of closures. And what you'll notice is that at about 20 years, the fish biomass levels at around 1,000 kilograms per hectare. And therefore you now have a good estimate of K, and this also gives you an estimate of productivity, because the rate is contained within this information. So you now have two very important variables to estimate the status of reefs and yields. The other graphs are just to show you that if you use data that is from low compliance closures or from small or young closures, you'll find that some of the relationships are not so good, and that makes sense, in the sense that if there's not high compliance on the no fishing, you won't get the same responses. So it's important to use data coming from areas greater than 5 square kilometer of closure, and it's important to look at these older closures, particularly those that are older than 20 years, to make sure these values have leveled. Another thing you can do with this data is look at the different categories of fish, because this is important for estimating yields. The total biomass of fish is interesting in terms of the ecological status, but in terms of fisheries, there's a lot of fish that is either too small or unedible or unpreferred, and therefore knowing that information is important. In particularly important is the target biomass. That's the fish that we target in fisheries. And you can see here that that target biomass is almost half the level of the total fish biomass. And that's where we're most interested in at measuring productivity. These are fish that could be sold in markets, and not just those that are used for the purposes of eating locally. And this is extremely important in Mauritius, mostly because there is fairly high biomass of fish on many of the fished reefs, in particularly the lagoons in Mauritius, because of the damselfish stegastes. This damselfish reaches 20 or 30 centimeters. It's a fairly large body. It's one of the largest damselfishes in the world, but people don't fish it, and it's not really considered an edible product, and certainly not sold. So you can get very different views of the fishery and the status of reefs in Mauritius, whether you include the damselfish stegastes or not. For example, here you can see that actually gear-restricted areas have more biomass than marine reserves, but that's because of the stegastes. If you remove that, you'll find the fishable biomass is now quite a bit different, and particularly the target biomass is almost a fourth of what the leveling value of around 540 kilograms per hectare. So that tells you that Mauritian reefs are overfished, and you're losing a considerable amount of productivity and income because of it. A nice development in spatial modeling is the ability to predict stocks if you can know something about the variables that predict stocks. So if you know important things like the depth or the time it takes for fishermen to travel, or the management status, sea surface temperature, reef area, net primary productivity, the country that the stock is located in, you can actually make pretty good estimates of what stock levels are like in areas where you haven't actually measured stocks. So you can predict them based on these predictive models that are based on the empirical data. So in all the areas that I've counted stocks, I can now come up with this predictive model, which is shown here, which is predicting pretty well stocks. And then that allows me to extrapolate to very broad regions and tell you what the expected stock levels are like. You can see in the bottom left by country that, after you account for all the various variables, there are countries with generally high stocks and countries with low stocks. You can see Kenya and Reunion among the lowest, and Mauritius not doing much better. This gives us an ability to avoid stock assessment. It's costly, but to give us some estimates of the status of stocks in each of these countries, and that makes us now able to start predicting a variety of issues such as yields and income on very large scales. Consequently, you can see that we can now model stocks on very large spatial scales. And since we know recovery, we can also model recovery rates. And that gives us also an indication of yields. And what I can tell you is that in many areas with these stocks below the 500 kilograms per hectare level, people are losing a lot of money due to the fact that they are not maximizing their yield. And I made an estimate for the East African ecoregion, and it's $76 million per year. And what my guess is that Mauritius, it's a much smaller area, but you're probably losing as much as $8,000 or so per square kilometer of reef because of low production. So there's consequences for not managing fisheries, not just for biodiversity, but actually income, employment, and food security. So, of course, what can we do about it is important as evaluating the problem, and I'll argue that there are solutions at various scales. At the small scale of the fishermen, this is one example of a solution we've worked on, which is to put gates and traps, that is to allow the smallest fish or the narrow-bodied fish to escape. And on the left is one that was created by an artisan who makes traps, but also on the right you can see we've been giving gates to fishermen, and they can sew these gates into the trap so that the smallest fish get out. Sort of at the mesoscale is something we've discussed before, is marine reserves, that these smallish marine reserves, in this case a 6 square kilometer marine reserve, what we found was that over a 24-year period, yields were very constant, whereas in areas with gear restrictions, the yields slowly decayed over time. So indicating that the gear restrictions were not sufficient for maintaining sustainability. So having 30% of your nearshore area in moderate-sized closures may be one way to solve this overfishing problem. And finally, there are these large-scale policy solutions, in particular improved incentives for employment and retiring policies. We studied this in the region some time ago, and what we found in Mauritius was that a lot of fishermen don't want to retire or exit the fishery because of the subsidies they get from the government. So what you've done is maintained effort above the optimal levels through policies that don't promote retirement or don't employ alternative employment. So these kind of large-scale policies are viable solutions. They may be politically difficult, but in fact, in the long run, they can help solve these problems. And then finally, I'd like to end this section by reminding people that one of the things we found very important is that people's willingness to participate in fisheries restrictions is dependent heavily on the status of the governance. And so if you look at people's governance, the way they scale governance, it often correlates very strongly with the way they they support restrictions. And it's possible to look at governance institutions, that's in the middle panel here, and to find which institutions are strong and weak, and to help build those institutions that are weak in order to improve governance. And in many cases, you'll find in weak fisheries, some of the common problems are that they don't monitor their resources, or they don't monitor their resource users. In many cases, they have conflicts with their neighbors. And thirdly, they often don't feel that there's a proper balance between costs and benefits. So if you can build those three aspects of the institutional parts of fisheries, you can help to overcome some of the weaknesses that lead to weak restrictions. The final section of this talk is about endemics and biodiversity. Mauritius is a unique location because of its island nature. It's isolated, and many species can evolve independently here and create their own species over evolutionary time, and that is the case. In many cases, these are often small-bodied individuals with limited larval dispersal, and in many cases they're damselfishes, but there are cases such as this black-banded hogfish that is also an endemic to this area, and also probably a commercially important species that may be threatened by their limited population size and isolation in Mauritius. This species in particular is probably a commercial species. I don't think it's commercially viable anymore, but because I've only seen 3 in all my dives in Mauritius, but it is present, and more needs to be known about its status in order that it doesn't go locally extinct through neglect. A survey some time ago identified the Mascarene Islands as the 4th most threatened fish fauna due to the isolated nature of the reefs here. And in many cases, this is due to these small-bodied fishes, damselfishes in particular, where you get unique species often formed by the isolation of species that are not able to disperse over large areas. So we made this a focus of one of our conservation projects in Mauritius, where we work closely with the university, reef conservation, the fisheries department, and dive industry to do a citizen science evaluation of the status of some of these endemics. We focused on 6 endemic fish and 6 corals that, if not endemic, are rare and mostly limited to this area. The results were quite interesting. There are some good news. For instance, the Mauritian clownfish seems to be doing fairly well. We found 93 in 119 dives. I don't think that's particularly abundant, but at least they are present on the island in fair numbers. So there were a number of, about 4 of the 6 species that we looked at had reasonable numbers. There is some bad news in that 2 of the species that we selected were not seen by the citizen science divers. In the 119 dives, I had seen the Creole damselfish in 2004 in some shallow lagoons, but I haven't seen it again, and we're very concerned about that species. On the right is the Mauritian damselfish, which is a very recently recorded species by Allen in 1991, and that species I haven't seen, nor has it been recorded in any of the diver surveys. So we're very concerned about these 2 species and whether they're still present or not. So going forward, we hope to continue to look for these species, identify if they still exist, where they're located, and determine whether there is need for conservation of these species. Another thing about this survey was that the distribution of damselfish is not uniform around the island. There are some endemics that live in the lagoon and others that live off the reef edge. And more importantly is that most of the endemics exist also in the north, similar to the better conditions for coral that I discussed earlier. A lot of the endemics tend to be on the north and west side. And that may partly be due to more observers But in many cases, we try and account for that in other areas by sampling in areas not experienced that divers don't dive in. But nonetheless, it seems like the distribution is focused in the north. In many cases, that seems to be a good thing because these are often tourist areas, and there should be a larger conservation ethic in this environment. And in fact, we did survey nearly 1,000 households to ask them about their perceptions of endemics, and what you find is Mauritians are very supportive of protecting and conserving endemics. Their views of the environment change from place to place a little bit, but there is a general perception that the country should prioritize conserving endemics. I'd like to present some findings from another study of the Western Indian Ocean and the biodiversity, so we can put some of the local studies in Mauritius in context of the Western Indian Ocean. We've done a large-scale survey of coral genera and numbers of fish in 6 families in over 1,000 sites throughout the Western Indian Ocean. And our goal there was to see if we could make predictions for high diversity spots throughout the region, including Mauritius. In order to do that, we developed a model for associations between observed richness in environmental variables. So we collated probably all of the environmental variable information that you can get for the region. That includes water temperatures, human demographic factors such as market locations, some estimates of fishing, marine protected areas, and a lot of other environmental variables like light and temperature and salinity, etc. We used a machine learning statistical method called boosted regression trees to look for the relationships, and then we tried to create the best models to make the predictions with the empirical data, and then use those environmental variable model to make predictions in areas for which there is no biodiversity data. This is the location of the actual study sites, the empirical data. Give you some idea of the coverage of the sites, and it's quite wide, including Mauritius. And this is the basis for them making the environmental variable model based on the environmental variables I discussed. This would be an example of some of the variables used in the model and how well they fit, in this case, the biodiversity of fish. It also shows that we looked at 2 different models to include as many variables as possible without eliminating them for arbitrary reasons. And then in the end, we combine these 2 models to make the predictions. But you can see here that the top predictor of biodiversity of fish is the biomass of fish, which shows the importance of protecting fish biomass if you want to have biodiversity. But other variables such as travel time to the location from the coastline is important. So is the sea surface temperature, the net primary productivity, the country in which the fish are located, a number of water flow or connectivity measurements as to inflow of currents into the area and their nearness to other sources, as well as things such as the distance to markets. These variables are then used to make the predictions in cells without any empirical data. And then without going into too many further details, this is what the grid map would look like. And the red squares that you see would give an indication of the squares that would be predicted to have the top 20% of biodiversity for fish on the left, for corals in the middle, and then the combined fish and corals on the right. The important thing here is that you get probably 3 biodiversity centers in Mauritius for the combined fish and coral. There's slight differences between the fish and coral, but in general you get the east coast in Marburg area as one of the biodiversity centers, and also the northeast and northwest sites as the high biodiversity centers. So we believe these are important locations for conservation and areas that Mauritians should think about ensuring their protection. Given that they're an island and biodiversity is isolated, it's important that the biodiversity that is there is protected. I want to finish the data part of this presentation by making people aware that conservation and development are not often at odds, and that's particularly true of fish because there's often an increase in biodiversity as you approach this maximum sustained yield level of 500 kilograms per hectare. This is shown in this slide here, and it turns out that Model B is probably the best model of biodiversity and yield, and that's shown on the right with the data from many countries in the Indian Ocean. That you have high biodiversity, you also have high yield production. So it's very possible to have them both, and one should not use arguments for food security or economics as a trade-off with biodiversity, because at least in fisheries, they're positively related. In conclusion, I want to remind the listeners that all of the solutions that are presented here are common solutions. That is, they are people getting together at various scales of human and organization and agreeing on how to manage resources in order that there's some optimization across different scales from the global to the local. That's very clear to most of us that look at climate change. You realize there's a global level issue here and you have to address it at that level. But it also has aspects of local commons problems, such as I showed in fisheries here, and that is that if you better manage your fisheries, some of the impacts of the global effects are not as large as they might be. Again, fisheries management, you've seen the solutions I offer here require a variety of local, mesoscale, and large-scale policy solutions, and in many cases, these are also issues of trade and issues of donor support. In many cases, these trade and donor support programs are not supporting sustainable management in fisheries, and this is a problem that has to be solved at multiple scales. Biodiversity, again, Mauritius has its local endemics. This is a local problem, but if they're lost here, it's a global problem in the sense that we're losing species that took millions of years for the planet to produce. So all of these solutions need human organization, getting commitments, and working on commons problems. It should be obvious to all of you now that the scale of the work that we're doing requires a lot of collaboration, both within countries and between countries. And in Mauritius, we're particularly grateful to the role that the many institutions shown here have done to help us. And they run, as you can see, from very local organizations such as the dive industry to national institutions such as the Ministry of Oceans, and as well the educational institutions such as the University of Mauritius. We're very grateful for their participation. It's been a pleasure working with you all, and we hope this work can continue into the future. And I'll end my talk there. It's been my pleasure speaking to you. I hope this was useful to you. There's a lot of information in the references in the papers, but I'm available for your question and answers. Many thanks for the opportunity to speak to you.